Thank you. And yeah, so this is a panel discussion with various artists, creatives, writers, and good people about humour in the arts. The overall theme of our degree show was power, and there's an exhibition and a publication which you can see upstairs in C202, and we decided to take the theme of power and look at it through institutional critique and humour, and how humour can be a tool to subvert power in the arts. So we've got a lovely panel of people whose practice kind of uses that in different ways, and it's chaired by Roger Sabin, and they can start now. So thanks for coming.
And thank you, of course, to the students for organising it. It's fantastic. So you've done a brilliant job, all of you. Right, well, thank you for coming. I'm really excited to be here. My name's Roger Sabin, and I'm a professor here. And my job is Professor of Popular Culture, which means I get to do all sorts of different things. But I think the reason I'm here is that I co-run a book list for the publisher Palgrave, and that's in comedy studies. So on that list, we've got things like books about Sarah Silverman, about Hannah Gadsby, about Monty Python, The Young Ones, stand-up, that kind of thing. So what I'm saying is that my background and the list is, it's not a fine art background at all. So I'm here to, it's all part of the plan, it's all part of the students' plan, that I'm here to learn from our panel, and I think it's going to be a really exciting conversation. So we've got a big panel today, as you can see, and I think what we're going to do, we're going to let them introduce themselves, tell you a little bit about themselves, what they do, and then I'm going to ask them a few questions, and then we're going to open it up to you. So do feel free to ask whatever you like, within reason, and we'll have a conversation. That would be great. All right then. So to kick off, then, would you like to start?
Yeah, just to talk about what I do, is that?
Just who, you know, name and rank and serial number, that kind of thing.
Yeah, my name's Andy Holden. I work as, I make art, and I think there's a number of pieces that I've made that probably warrants my inclusion here. Just one is called Laws of Motion in a Cartoon Landscape, and it's about the kind of the history of the animation, but the premise is that the world is now best understood as a cartoon, and it operates through cartoon logic and cartoon physics, and that the golden age of animation was a kind of premonition of the world to come. And so the only way we can understand our current kind of moment is to look back at people like Daffy Duck and Mickey Mouse and Bugs Bunny and Wile E. Coyote. So I made a long animation with myself as a cartoon character talking about that. I also, when I was a teenager, I had a manifesto called Maximum Irony, Maximum Sincerity, which I wrote when I was about 19, and then I went to art school, and then none of the tutors liked it at all, and so I dropped it. But then, like as a sort of revenge thriller, 10 years later, I got an exhibition at the Tabloid collection, and decided to bring the whole art movement that had failed back to life, but with teenagers from Bedford playing me and my friends in this kind of new revamped version of it, where we, and the idea was you had to be, to operate in the current moment, you had to be both ironic and sincere simultaneously. There was no longer any difference. So that was I have done and dabbled by accident in stand-up. I had a very scary gig of supporting one of my heroes, Simon Munnery, and opening for him, and because he thought that maybe there would be this possibility of crossing over from making artworks that he thought had a funny premise to doing stand-up itself, and that was maybe I'll talk about that later. It was quite a strong learning curve, but and really there is quite a big difference between the two. I can vouch for that. I don't know. What else? Is that? I mean, do you want more? Is that enough?
That's great. I mean, I could listen all day, right. But that's fine.
Yeah, otherwise it's just going to be a night's talk.
Okay.
All right, over.
That's lovely. Thank you.
I'm sorry. So I'm Elise Bell. I'm a freelance arts writer, so I'm not making art, but I am criticising other people's art instead. I guess I'm on this panel today because I was one of the co-creators for a social media brand, if I'm going to up it up, called Tabloid Art History. which was on Twitter and Instagram, where we found images from art history and compared them to tabloid images. So Beyonce would be paired with a beautiful Madonna painting, and it was just kind of annoying a lot of right-wing American Christians who found that really insulting. So that's why I'm here. It's lasted 2 years, and over that time we set up a zine, Tabloid Art History Volume 1 and 2. The idea was to look at the intersection of popular culture and art history. Why aren't we talking about art history and popular culture in a way in which it's put on an equal platform and an equal playing field? And then we've also done speaking opportunities at the National Gallery, at the Tate, and finally I'm at Central St. Martin's. It's like come full circle. So yeah, that's me.
Okay, so just to clarify, you're a writer, but you're a maker as well. You're an artist as well.
Well, no one's ever called me an artist. Thank you. Yeah, I would say the writing definitely has fed into a creation of what I would refer to as a discussion and an opportunity to talk about art in a different way. Okay. So yeah, I'm going to change my bio to artist now. Thank you.
Feel free. I'll get 15%. Yeah.
Hi. Hi. So I'm Joe Sweeney. I am an installation artist for now. And then I recently recently had a project which I've got like a stammer, which was on like a beach in Kent, and it was like it was kind of like a sculpture, it was like a sculpture of like a phone box, and you call up and you leave your message for Europe, and it's like a work about Brexit, but I didn't kind of intend to make a work about Brexit. It kind of ended up that way. It's good. It kind of interacted with the public to kind of give like a vocal to give a point of to put like a focus on like kind of how people have to use their voices to give their opinions in the project. And so there was a lot of humour in that, like amongst all of like all the anguish and fear that is like in the country at the moment. So so I suppose my work and probably why I'm here, it's kind of like a macabre. Well, I don't know, is that the word we were talking about before, weren't we?
Morbid humour.
Yeah, kind of like morbid humour, but it's kind of like sort of like a sardonic sort of sense in my work, I think, which has probably led you to me, to the people who've organised this. Yeah, and that's kind of what's in my practice, and that's kind of what I work off at the moment. Yeah.
Thank you.
Is this thing on? Just like a comedian. My name's Doug Fishbone. I'm a visual artist. I work mostly in video and performance work and installation. And I use a lot of comedy, stand-up style structures in my work. I was referred to one person as a stand-up conceptual artist, which I thought was a good thing. But I'm just very interested in using humor more as a strategy for opening up a discussion. I'm sure this is a question we'll get into in more depth, but some of the projects I've done, use a humorous stance to try to invite people into a discussion. One piece I did, I switched an old master's painting with a fake from China in an old master's museum in London a few years ago to see how people would respond to that. And I've also worked, I did a large-scale miniature golf project at the Venice Biennale. So bringing in a kind of funny platform that actually opens up a lot of interesting, I hope, discussion, but using the humor as a sort of strategic gambit. So, that's me.
Very interesting. Thank you.
I'm Mel Brimfield. Hello. Some top comedy highlights. So I also am from Bedford, Andy, and I have a Simon Munnery story. We restaged Andy Kaufman's Intergender Wrestling as part of the London Word Festival quite a long time ago now, but that was that was quite something. So had Tony Law, Kevin Eldon were doing the commentary for it, and Josie Long, Issy Sooty, a band of dancers called the Bow Bells. Everyone fought him, and he abused women throughout. That was quite fun. So I worked directly with comedians. What else? And I made this whole documentary series called "This Is Performance Art," adopting the voice of a very privileged white man telling us about the world. This is really unfamiliar. I have a problematic relationship with those linguistic registers because I'm obsessed with them and replicate them, and I'm not sure I'm entirely critical of them in some respects in terms of the way that I use them. But yes, Frances Spalding, it's the name of a female art historian, was the mouthpiece for this series, and this is one of the images from it, in fact. It's a comedian, Joe Neary, posing as a fictional performance artist. So I made loads of documentation for performance art that probably should have existed but didn't, that was related to comedy, histories of variety, theatre, music, dance, interdisciplinarity, when there was a lot of focus on body and gender-oriented practice from that sort of 60s conceptual route that we all know. That's probably enough.
I'm David Campbell, part of Common Culture. Ian's also part of Common Culture, so I get the opportunity to say all the things, and then he's got the problem of what to talk about in a minute. So common Culture basically is the three of us, and we're kind of interested in the relationship between popular culture and forms of high culture, in particular kind of collision to do with class and consumption. We've used comedy quite a lot. We've done a number of projects. One was about the idea of what is the nature of local identity within a globalized culture. We thought that comedy in particular was a mechanism by which that could be tested and worked through. So we did a series called Local Comics, which consisted of paying 15 to 20 comics from around the country to see if there was a sense of that local identity in register through comedy. We are also interested in the idea of kind of alienated labour. That came together in the comedy piece where the comedians were asked to perform their routine, which is usually 20 minutes for an hour, in front of an empty comedy club to a single point camera, which was horrific. Every one of the comedians agreed to do it, saw the footage and was more than happy to do it, and actually found great pleasure in doing that. So there's something about the idea of comedy as carrier of potential for kind of critical engagement. Ian can talk a bit more about Common Culture. The other thing I do with the other member of Common Culture, who's Mark Durden, is that we curate exhibitions. The most recent was Double Act Art and Comedy, which is at the Blue Cart in Liverpool, and the MAC in Belfast, and The Laughable Enigma of Ordinary Life, which was in the Azores. And that looks at the relationships between art and comedy and the various kind of strategies that artists use within contemporary practice.
I'm Ian Brown. I'm part of Common Culture.
There's more to say. There's more to say. It's a rich practice.
Well, I guess some of the we're interested in looking at humour and comedy as a subject, but then we're also interested in kind of trying to utilise it to kind of critique some of the kind of rituals, particularly within the art world, that we encounter and that we're part of. And a lot of times, some of those kind of critiques are about certain types of mechanisms that persist, including our own role within it. And we're quite aware that sometimes our own activities are kind of as ridiculous as the conditions that prevail in which we operate as well. So, yeah, we're kind of interested in those kind of different perspectives.
Okay, thank you very much. What an amazing panel. So, different kinds of laughter, different practices, lots in common and lots not in common. So, I mean, my questions are basically through the students. These are the kind of student questions that I'm going to voice. But there's this idea that you're both inside the art world and critiquing it at the same time. And how do you negotiate that? Can it be done? And what are the... Tell me about it, basically. That's the first question from the students, is this idea of being in it but outside it at the same time. I think they described the art world as artsy, speaky, kissy, airy, which is a wonderful piece of writing. I wonder if you feel the same way about it.
Well, I think it's observation, isn't it? And reinterpretation of what you see. Is that what you're talking about? Kind of observing the art world
Well,
What-
I mean,
critiquing is. Could you see it as like sort of like a reinterpretation, but with your own spin?
I guess you could. I mean, tell me. That's a question for the rest of you, actually.
No, I just thought I'd kick things off with just a thought that came to mind.
That's good.
It's what you do in these panels, isn't it?
You're scaring me now.
Yeah.
But so reinterpretation rather than critiquing.
I mean, I think that's part of it. It's about kind of adopting, as kind of Ian suggested, the idea that there are these kind of rituals, there are these structures that we operate in. I mean, the idea of like, well, what is outside of that? You know, what position can you be outside of that? In terms of, you know, we're part of the kind of art system, so therefore it's about observations from within, and at the same time looking to find ways in which others can be party to that in terms of an accessibility. I mean, I think one of the things about comedy is that you don't necessarily need a PhD to access art which deals with comedy, because it has a kind of currency and a fluency which is part of the popular culture. So it's already freighted with a sense of knowledge that people have. So it's really, really useful mechanism to try and find some kind of relationships with an audience, which I imagine, I mean, we're not stand-up comedians, but I mean, it seems to me that one of the bases of comedy is about finding those kind of bonds, those relationships with an audience, so you can talk to them. So comedy is a really, really useful, appropriate technique, strategy, whatever you want to call it, to enable commentary, which often might then be about quite specific things about what it is to be involved in the art world. And there's plenty to laugh about in that.
But I think it's probably a bit like art bands who aren't very good quite often. Art comedy tends to not be very funny, except for the people who are directly involved in it. So I think that's an issue that's quite interesting, that if you're constantly making work for this sort of closed circuit of the art world to laugh at itself, that possibly is exclusive as well. So it's like it's finding some register between. If you can do something that is genuinely fantastically entertaining but carries loads of conceptual weight at the same time, then that's what I dream of, lads. That's the future. But yeah, I think it can be difficult if you're making, as a person who's made lots of jokes in this very snide kind of particular 60s art critic voice. Yeah, I once did a performance at the Liverpool Tate, and it was for a load of world experts on sculpture and performance, and they were laughing like drains. And I've done the same performance in lots of other places, and tumbleweed across the stage. So I realised what a smug arse I was for lots of these kind of. Isn't this hilarious? And then realised no, it's not at all, and it's very exclusive and annoying. So yeah, it's about varying register somehow. If you can do that, so that at one moment there's a moment of access that's really obvious, at another one that if you know a bit more, it has more layers. I'm kind of interested in something that I like comedy audiences because it's something's either funny or it ain't. So bringing together art and comedy audiences is quite a dangerous thing to do, because it's not, our audiences will watch anything really. It's
Yeah, and there's always that aspect in an art audience that, if you come out and do a terrible performance, you can say it was meant to be self kind of destructive. I've seen people get booed off the stage in comedy clubs. It's brutal. You make them laugh or you don't. That's how you keep score. And I think that issue of frame is really, really tricky, because I think in an art audience, the minute you go into an art space, you're open to anything. And that's wonderful, but also kind of depletes something about surprise and shock and all that to me. Because you always say, oh, maybe it's art. Because I'm actually thinking of trying to do some stand-up comedy in a conventional comic environment. It scares the shit out of me. Because, all the jokes that I say that misfire in my art performance, they might just throw a bottle at me and say, get the hell off the stage, you're not funny. We paid for this, get out of here. So, that notion of context and frame to me is really vital. Because it's something I struggle with, because I think in a lot of ways, contexts outside of the art world are much more interesting to operate in because of that, because they're not as porous and they have harder boundaries in a way.
Yeah, if you're after humiliation, it's a good place to head outside the art world. I think,
you can be humiliated in the art world as well.
Oh, yeah.
I wonder what you two think.
Yeah, so going back to the idea of kind of critiquing something whilst you're within it, And how does that work? How can you make a valid critique of the art world if you are acting within it and often, you know, keep doing the stereotypes associated with the art world? Like, does it matter about your critique? So I watched The Square.
I haven't seen that yet.
When that came out, and I remember there was a scene when there's some jokes in there, but to get the jokes you have to have read some theory essentially, and I found myself like tears down my face laughing, and then I was like, oh wait, they're making fun of me. This is like I'm the problem here. And it can be quite a difficult relationship to manage. There's a fantastic, there was a performance art group, I don't know if you can even call them that, called the V Girls. I don't know if anyone here is aware of them. It was a troupe of young women. One of them was Andrea Fraser, who's now a very eminent feminist art historian, writer, critic. And they would put on panel talks exactly like this, using the terminology and the language of the kind of Freud and Lacan and all those kind of great debates, and they would talk about art in these terms. And the performance continued for a few years, and then they stopped because they were like, we're performing to the same people. We're performing to our audiences. They're laughing at our jokes because they can relate to it, but the critique, is it there anymore? So I think it's a difficult relationship to manage, and it's easy for me to talk about it because I don't make art in a conventional sense. So I'd be interested to know more about how everyone here kind of navigates that role.
That's nicely put, yeah.
I think what Doug said about the openness of art is kind of interesting as a space, because for humour to take place, you need this like kind of almost an incongruity or a release, or like there's a sort of, or a different sense of expectation that then you can deny. But then if everything's kind of possible, you can't.
Yeah,
it's very difficult to identify the moment of humour. For me, I'm not that interested in art world critique. That's almost the type of art that I really dislike. Or critique. I came from an art school where critique was like held up as the highest value, like or the only thing that art was supposed to do. So I suppose what you do is then react against that. And for me, maybe what I've always been drawn to, I also perform in my band, and then I've tried out doing stand-up and all different elements where art just does push onto stuff. But I guess I've always been drawn to the popular culture element because critique isn't so prevalent, you know, and you can be affirmative, you can play to different emotional spectrum, and that maybe the space of like that humour isn't really about interpretation so much, whereas I would say, like, whereas art, that is the primary thing that you need for humour to take place. You need a sort of state of play or playfulness or something. So these two things are just a bit incongruous. So I think that's why it can go so wrong. There's a different set of expectations. But it's definitely what I find art, paradoxically, the best place to sit myself, because I can do anything in it, and it can be the most flexible. So I can kind of make an album or do different kinds of shows, or make animations or whatever, and it's easiest to hide under the umbrella of art. But I'm always constantly kind of maybe more enamoured by, or have more drawn or to, or get more from stand-up or music, because critique isn't its like main mode of operation.
See, I'm also like sort of you. I'm not interested in art world sort of critique. I think I take a lot of my work from the observation of everyday actions on people, and I think, like, sort of coming back to what sort of you said at the beginning about humour as like it's like an accessible form of like a language within art, or you know, it's like a way to talk to someone through like kind of like a common and sort of like it's like kind of like a shared experience with those sorts of references. Sorry, what was I talking about again? I was just trying to link on talking about kind of you know, like my practice and.
So
I think art world critique can be, like, for me at an early point in my career, it was really important, because I felt like the sort of performance art that was being made wasn't what I wanted to see represented at all, and I'm a sort of vintage comedy nut, and I'm really obsessed with all that stuff and have been for a really long time. And I just thought, why is this excluded from the conversation? Why does everything have to be sort of abstract and image-oriented and related to this particular history? So actually using this authoritative art world voice to restate a history that I thought I could insert work into felt really important. And actually when you think about histories of excluded voices, I think somehow for me, as a premise, as a platform, I'm not doing that anymore. I don't make art about art anymore, but it felt actually very important, and humour seemed like a really good way to be quite aggressive, actually, in a way that seemed necessary to me at the time. Yeah.
I mean, I'm struck by what some of you have been saying about, are we talking about social class? I mean, you raised this point.
Yeah,
actually.
sure.
And are we talking about bringing supposedly low culture into a middle-brow setting? Is that what this is about sometimes?
I think for common culture, I mean, that is a kind of trigger. That is one of the kind of interests. It's about a kind of a lack of familiarity to some extent in terms of the kind of culture that I came from, and a sense of not being, it didn't seem to be the world that I knew particularly well. I mean, kind of example was the first time I'd been into an art gallery was the Lang Art Gallery in Newcastle, and there was an exhibition of David Hockney's Rake's Progress. So all these kind of prints with the print number, and I thought that was the mark he'd got in terms of out of 20. 15 out of 20. I thought, fuck, I'm going to pull my socks up. He's got 15 out of 20 for that. So so that idea of like, where you kind of fit within a certain kind of culture, you suddenly become part of a world that is different from the one that you're used to. So for me, there is I think in terms of kind of common culture, there is this sense of a way of contesting cultural value and finding points of collision, which is about this kind of battle.
Yeah. So that's so interesting. I wonder if the rest of you would agree with that. You've also spoken about comedy as being a conduit for people to enter that world.
Yeah. I mean, I know that when starting Tabloid Art History, it came from a place of how can I be studying a subject that I love and yet feel totally unfamiliar to it, totally kind of outside of the circle for it. And the idea was that, matching high culture art with low culture tabloid images, and that in itself is quite a problematic turn of phrase when you're referring to things as low culture when really it's mass culture. You are adding this critical value on something which often is enjoyed by everyone, in the same way that art should also be enjoyed by everyone. And I think, artists and writers also kind of do that at the same time. They kind of lower mass culture to raise up their work, and it makes things very, very inaccessible. Like, class is often at the heart of it, because humour is such a great gateway into so many subjects or so many issues that you might not have ever kind of considered or seen talked about before.
And I think the art world is such a strange context as an ecosystem or economy, because ultimately, if we're talking about art that sells in a commercial framework, it's largely to this very privileged, the hedge funder kind of class. So it's a weird thing to do all this stuff that ultimately, if it succeeds, does so on a very, very strange frame of reference, which is selling to a rarefied group of wealthy people. Obviously, not all art is meant for that channel, but it does make it a bit odd. It's one reason I really love the Marx Brothers, that kind of notion of comedy where these people just sort of barge into this usually much more rarefied social situation and wreak havoc. And it's certainly an aspiration.
Well, a follow-up question then would be, can anybody enjoy the kind of art that you make? Because as you've said, the places that you make this art, for a lot of you, are these quite exclusive venues where you need cultural capital to understand what's going on, by definition. So, I mean, it seems like an impossible thing to ask. Can anybody enjoy your art?
In my own case, I like to hope.
Can anybody? I would say for me.
Does anyone? Does anyone?
Does anyone?
But no, I would say for me, because I do performances that are close enough to stand up and modes of presentation that are familiar, I'm hoping people can just come in and think, oh, what's this, and follow it and say, oh, that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
I don't care whether it's really defined as art at this
No,
point.
no.
But I think it's interesting as a practitioner to try venues that are outside of that framework, and that's why I'm really trying. There's a thing. There's a what's it called? The Backyard Comedy Club. If any of you guys know of it, they do a monthly event called Comedy Unleashed, which is meant to be this libertarian comedy night where kind of anything goes. Because comedy itself has a huge amount of, kind of parameters in terms of what you can say, what you can get away with. And they try to override that for a night so people can do. And I'm thinking of maybe trying something there and seeing if I get bottled off the stage. But, without ever testing that, I think ultimately I will feel like I'm, operating in a very closed circuit, which is a strange thing, but at the same time it allows me to operate. It's not ideal.
But comedy is so commercial, that's the thing.
Yeah.
If you spend any time at the Edinburgh Festival, for example, you'll see it's basically a showcase in a way that it didn't used to be for, just it's so rarefied to this particular thing now. The economic structures for all these performance spaces are completely different. So a kind of open mic night, or a night where you sign up for a bill, that's great, you know, I mean, but and there is something about putting yourself in front of those audiences that will be unforgettable for you, for sure. But I think there's kind of like there's something really difficult about
hidden threat.
You're not going to be invited.
I mean, no, but I think in order to kind of make I don't know, things that in performance that require rehearsal, maybe actors. I can't perform, I stink, but I write. So I write for other people to perform now, I've realised. But all of that stuff economically isn't supported as a practice within the art world currently. So that's another issue, whatever, that needs to be discussed. And of course, comedy makes loads of money. Even like a night like that will have kind of like a door charge, a thing.
And a bar and whatnot.
Yeah, all that stuff. So art doesn't have those structures for it to grow organically. So you end up doing a weird thing that's an add-on to a show, a bit awkwardly at the beginning, like, and it's all a bit like, oh no, I missed it, I was at the bar, sorry. So it's kind of like a peculiar kind of thing. If you want to do anything that's ambitious, tight, kind of really, honed, rehearsed, whatever, it's difficult to support economically. I think the art world supports a version of comedy that's about failure, about not being funny, about not being ambitious in terms of the way that it's staged and performed, which I really want to challenge. Let's start that now. But anyway, yeah.
Can I bring the rest of you in on this one? This idea that, you mentioned Simon Munnery, and that's a very interesting connection.
I've been working with Simon for the last few years, making some short films around kind of him writing bits and me visualising things for like promos for last year's Edinburgh Festival and for this year. And it was someone that when I was growing up I was a fan of, and he just became we collaborated on a few things, and it was this interesting moment where it suddenly flipped over from we go to the market every Wednesday and buy vegetables together in Bedford, and we talk and we test out different things. I'll tell him about my ideas and he'll tell me about his, and one day he said, well, you should just try this out with a comedy audience. And so I had to do but it was an interesting moment. It was exactly the sort of thing that I would have done as a performance work, but for a completely different crowd and ticketed and quite full and with a sort of level of expectation. And I walked onto the stage. I actually really, really enjoyed it because I wasn't nervous at all, because I knew I fundamentally wasn't something I wanted to do, which gave me this kind of freedom. This is not something I need to be particularly good at, but I'm interested. And it was half an hour, so it was quite a long slot. And but I came on and I had a cup of tea and I put it down and everyone laughed. And I was like, oh, this is a completely different way of looking. That was not out, and for me that was outside of the show. That was a practical. But then there was this level of looking, and people were looking to laugh, and so it was a completely different level of expectation. You could feel the eyes working in a different way. I'm like really glad I did it, because it was, and actually it went okay enough for him to ask me to do a few more, and then we took it on the road, and it was interesting trying it out in different places. Essentially for me though, like the continuation from art was it's like always a kind of emotion. Some people it's a formal experiment, some people it's whatever kind of experiment. For me it was a kind of an emotional experiment, test myself to see whether, and it's normally an emotional space that I'm trying to make, and this show was, it actually was terrifying. I'll tell it because it was maybe like, it was a true story. When Simon asked me to do this, and I didn't really know what I was going to do, and then my grandma passed away literally that week, and I inherited 6 boxes of China cats, which is her entire collection of ceramic cats, which is basically all she had. And then for my show, all I did was unbox these cats one by one out the boxes, and then I had a live camera. I'd hold the cat up, and I'd tell stories about my grandma and about cats. And I just hold it, and it got quite weepy because, I mean, the first line was my grandma passed away last week, and everyone laughed, and it was actually true. And again, so I was really learning on the spot. But then so we went through it, and then he got quite a sad place, talking about Alzheimer's and cats, and then at the end, I asked Simon to come up and stop me and say, "Is that, you've got to stop there. I think that's probably enough. You've done your slot. How did it feel?" And I say, "It felt cathartic." And that was the entire...
Cathartic.
Yeah.
Cathartic.
So it was really only one joke, but half an hour of really morbid, self-involved narcissism.
A shaggy cat story.
Yeah. But it was fun, and then I realised, you can fake this, and you helped me sort of form it a bit, because that was actually real. And then there was, but the framework that people would look at, you could hold a cat up to a camera, and everyone would laugh. You could put it down, it would make a clunk sound. It would laugh. It was such a different level of expectation. And then going back to then doing more performances for art spaces, it definitely it taught me a lot. I now do a very elaborate thing with a green screen where I green screen myself into cartoons and jump in and out of them and try and narrate the physics whilst inside, and it has lighting and a head mic, and it's all and it's totally scripted and worked out. So it's very close to what Mel was saying, really, I think in terms of trying to learn, I want that type of close looking, not this just someone's doing something, it's kind of an art performance, and almost nothing that happens within it seems to matter that much, but within the comedy performance, every tiny thing is scrutinized. And that type of looking, to me, was a real lesson.
Yeah, really fascinating. So, the art environment, a gallery has certain advantages, as you said. It's a kind of a sacred space. You can say things you wouldn't otherwise be able to say. But a stand-up club is also another kind of space where,
But do you
where the
think
expectations are completely different.
But do you think people go the sort of humour in art is to be found, not to be sort of put out there, as in if you're in a comedy space? I mean, obviously it can be something that's obviously funny, but within an artistic environment or a show or whatever, it's for someone to find themselves.
I think
potentially. I think that's
an
interesting kind of difference between somebody who who's doing a stand-up, because it's in sort of actually how they act and how they talk, and whereas it's I'm coming sort of from a point of a piece of art on the wall or a sculpture, not sort of a performance.
But I laughed at your phone box on the beach.
The phone box on the beach. If you saw it in real life,
yes,
it looked like it was on a beach because it was on a webcam. We set it up. You can't put it on the beach because it's like a beach, and there's no you can't sort of actually get anything to it, and it's kind of in the middle of the beach, and so basically we put it on to the end of a pub garden. So if you turn the camera around, you pan over the pub garden, people eating fish and chips, and at the end there's a big slide that's
you've ruined
it. It's kind of like an elephant slide, big elephant slide, and the whole work's about Brexit. It's kind of just sort of turned about into this elephant in the room scenario. Yeah. But yes.
Okay.
I'd like you to think it's on a beach.
Thank you. No,
so let's just ignore what I said.
Actually, this is something that maybe you guys can talk to, having curated. I was involved in a show at the Hayward a few years ago called Laughing in a Foreign Language, and it was a show about humor. And what was really interesting was to see the press response, because people invariably, one particularly obnoxious review, they seemed to beat up on me a lot in this show for whatever reason, but they were saying, I'm at the Hayward show and I'm not laughing. And the assumption was that a show about comedy and humor is to be funny. And that struck me as a very interesting, that's a decision. It doesn't have to be funny. It's about comedy, it's about humor as a space and a set of practices. But people assumed, especially in the media, whatever, to cover the show, that they were to be made to laugh. And a lot of the artists in the show were playing in that problematic surf there. And so you guys, having curated, I'm curious, how do you, what was your thinking when you,
Well, I was just thinking we had a review of a work that we made which wasn't utilising humour whatsoever, and the critique was, this isn't funny. But I guess they'd seen previous work and had expectations, and it wasn't anything to do with the work at all. It was the one in Nottingham. It was a kind of,
so because it was you, they expected it to be funny, and it wasn't.
You have to maintain the lap through all the work.
Yes.
But the curatorial thing, you can answer.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the curatorial thing, you saying, Andy, about the idea that it's about kind of looking. I mean, in terms of the curation, it was about being interested in artists and how they kind of looked at the world and how they then articulated that for an audience. So it just, I mean, I think one of the things that probably needs to be emphasized for us is that we make the kind of work we make because we enjoy the playfulness. There's something about, I think we're quite funny with each other in terms of our group. So it's not as if we're kind of mixing in something which is external to our sensibilities. I think we have sensibilities which are suited to a particular way of thinking and looking at the world, which happens to find form within a comedic strategy. So in the kind of curation of the exhibitions that we've organised, both of which weren't funny exhibitions. I mean, this is the kind of thing that you're talking about. That
It shouldn't be necessarily.
Yeah, you're always judged by that, but they're not really.
Yeah.
You didn't hear people kind of rip-roaring laughter as you went around the exhibitions, but it was about looking at ways in which a whole range of different strategies, from slapstick to deadpan to a whole range of strategies, have been used by different artists to think about the world in which they live. And that was what interested us about, okay, well that seems to be kind of indicative of a certain form of structure to do with a joke. I mean, Bill Woodrow, we used a Bill Woodrow sculpture from the 1980s, which isn't normally conventionally talked about in terms of comedy, but we saw a similarity in terms of a kind of setup, a formal setup about a punchline, etc., etc. So it was about trying to find ways in which, all of us find certain things a way of generating knowledge about the world, and comedy is something which is intrinsic to the way that we think about it. And it seems to have a degree of accessibility with others as well. But I mean, some of the work we chose, we didn't find particularly funny, but it was representative of a type of practice.
Can I bring you in, Elise? Because we're talking about performance, installations, that kind of thing, but it sounds like your work is more about sort of fanzine humour and bringing that in and sort of juxtaposing different images.
Yeah, I mean, so my practice has been based on what I found funny and where do I spend my time. Growing up at the rise of social media, meme culture, it has very much kind of fed into how I look at images and how I see art. It feels like now an image can be put on the internet and within an hour there'll be so many different interpretations of it going off in the wildest, weirdest, humorous directions possible. And it's certainly fed into the way I look at art, the way I experience going around an art gallery. It's made me see art as probably more funny than it should be. And also I think we talk about art and we talk about space and making funny art in an art museum or in an art venue. But the opportunities are so endless and so vast. You're given this kind of free rein to create whatever the fuck you want. And it can be good, it can be bad, but you are making these weird realities and calling it art. So of course, inevitably, they're going to be really, really funny, and it feeds really well into social media culture as it is now, which is just insanely fast, insanely ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah, I try and stay away from
Yeah.
it myself, but yes, I'm sure you're going to get
much.
some questions about that later on, actually. Well, listen, I've got one big theme that the students wanted to raise, which I'm going to ask you about, but then I think we'll open it up and have a bigger discussion. But one of the things they wanted to ask you, is about political correctness and the sort of censorship, self-censorship, that kind of thing, and whether comedy and the kind of work that you do can be a challenge to that, or even if you want to challenge that. So that's the theme. I wonder if you want to talk to that.
So I'd say one thing with making work about like kind of observational work about like kind of every day, because everyone's every day is different, isn't it? We're coming back to the idea of the class something. So I think one of the one of the things you need to be aware of is like appropriation of a certain everyday thing that could be seen as a class sort of issue or something that, you know, is that...
Can you give an example?
Michael McIntyre. Yes, sorry.
I think an example. Well, you know, like sort of if you think of like the sort of culture in Britain, you think of like pubs and cafes and things. These are the sort of things that people sometimes see you're appropriating working class culture. I mean, I don't make work about pubs and cafes and things, but like, you know, these are but there are elements. There's like so it's sort of like it's almost sort of more of like it's like kind of like a conversational. It's like I can't think of the word. You know, that's kind of what's more in my work is like kind of that kind of interaction. But I think that's one of the like so maybe one of the pitfalls of making every observational work is that.
So you have to be
very
careful.
That's sort of maybe my like addition to the awareness.
But you're an artist. You can do what you want.
Yeah.
I know.
But like a good old-fashioned racist
I know, but well,
joke,
this
right?
is what I've encountered. This is what I feel sometimes there's a, you know, that's the issue that you brought on. I thought that was something that I like sort of have felt in the past. But yes, I think you can do what you want if you're an artist. Yes.
No,
really?
Of course you can't.
How
No.
interesting. Okay. Now we're in.
I think a good mix of anger and generosity. I liked what Andy was saying earlier about kind of wanting to find something affirmative and kind of like wanting to speak sometimes in a quite genuine voice and then affecting a snide voice and then all of those things I think at various points are appropriate, and some of the best art and comedy of course comes from anger, like Bank, Bill Hicks, the misogyny side of course, but you know, I still find that incredibly politically powerful in terms of, you know, things he was against. Like, you need that rage, you need that anger. It shouldn't be that things are apologised for. But if you look at the body of the Bill Hicks catalogue, I mean, it speaks of a massive liberal. It's not, you know, I don't know. So I think there's kind of some idea of being, I don't know, generosity, allow people to breathe, but then, you know, punch them in the face again. Yeah, so don't just keep going until it becomes unbearable and it's intolerable and it becomes a message that's hard to take. That's why I think humour can be really valuable, because you can be incredibly strident and critical and angry, but you can cloak it in it gives you power to speak through those registers, you know?
I just would like to say I think there's something to be said about people putting their work up on Instagram. I think that's probably where this arises a lot from, is that people then can sort of actually take it out of context, kind of misinterpret, and then make it into a whole other issue. I think that this is maybe as like an artist who's just starting out, it could be one of the things that sort of makes you a bit more sort of actually guarded and you know, less inclined to explore in a way of just, well, it's art, I can do what I fucking want. Do you know what I mean?
Hang on, I'm not understanding you. You mean
Well,
the backlash against?
Well, but because if you put something up on the internet as you would as like a young art, I don't know, it's just the culture we're in where you do stuff like that. But yeah, the idea that you could put something up and within, you know, like an hour you could have so many people and you could just become like a villain. It's so it's like sort of you turn into your own sort of worst nightmare, like, you know, like sort of like a tabloid. Do you know what I mean?
If you do that age 20, then where do you know? That's a lot of pressure.
This is the world we live in, and this is what people do.
I mean, there's you know, a really obvious example that comes to mind is the image of Pepe the Frog. I'm sure you guys are all aware of it. This cartoon frog that looks a bit sad was initially quite funny, shared online, and was since appropriated by the alt-right, by fascists, and has become this kind of visual signifier for hate speech, racism, bigotry. And it got to a point where the creator of the comic from which it was created has sued various news outlets, various media personalities for using his image in that way. And it brings to mind, how do you control your image from that kind of reception in the age of the internet? How do you stop something so innocent kind of spiraling into something completely different to how you set out from it? It's an interesting time to be creating images in a world which just wants to see how far you can push it, how far can that image go, and it's a sad example.
I'd say also it's a very difficult, sort of strange moment for humour in general. For the I don't know if do you know this book Kill All Normies by Angela Nagel about
What's
the
it
rise
called?
of the alt-right, Kill All Normies.
Yeah.
And she talks about not just, I mean, the humour is part of it, but she talks about like transgression being the tool of the left for a long time, but now being the switch towards basically co-opted by the right. The right were much better at and using irony and the cloak of humour to usher in quite a lot of fascist ideas, but through this idea of irony. And she maps the whole rise of kind of Trump through this sort of shift that no one saw of the kind of weaponising of irony and humour to increase this kind of space for within the right. So there's that on the one hand, and then there's the other hand that the humour is kind of slightly, or a feeling that it might be losing its power in terms of political critique that I'm kind of definitely been wrestling with. And it's something I talked to Simon about because a lot of the alternative comics who came out in the 80s, it was like a way of, it was all anti-Thatcher, it was all about, with a very, like, about, he would say that, like, that you'd have at the end of the night, everyone would have a good laugh, but nothing would kind of change. And I think we're finding a sort of funnier moment now, or even more accentuated, where, because some of things are so absurd, and some people who are in charge are so kind of weirdly using humour, like, or certainly idiosyncrasy, that humour becomes very hard as a mode of critique.
They're beyond satire.
Exactly. So, like, the sort of idea that, like, South Park said that, had to stop doing politics because it was impossible for it to mock it anymore, or to make, or the fact that laughter, all it was doing was producing seemingly more of the same. It was not, all it was doing was spreading the possibilities of some of these feelings becoming real. Like, it was very hard to sort of, and I would think about that a lot also. I don't know if, this is a very old essay by Adorno and Hockenheim about the problem of laughter with Donald Duck. And it's like, they hate Donald Duck because they say, the idea is it's funny, and then people laugh at the misfortunes of Donald and they identify with him, and there's this kind of cathartic laughter, but then at the end that kind of, they feel better for having laughed, but it releases their necessity of potential political change or in his idea, revolution. Like the idea that laughter is kind of bad at this point in time for him, because it means you start to become comfortable with where you are by just laughing at the world around you as a way of a release. And I think we're kind of seeing this funny moment again where I'm sort of starting to think about that in terms of like how to use humour at the moment in relation to politics and in terms of meme culture and all that stuff, because it's so easily absorbed and it's so easily twisted, as you were saying, that it doesn't seem to have this satire or the political bite that it did.
Well, these things may just be cyclical. Who knows?
Yeah, that's what I'm feeling. I'm feeling a some kind of.
But if we're beyond satire, that puts all of you in a terrible position.
Yeah,
Be out of work, won't we?
That's very depressing.
But then maybe saying that something's beyond satire is a really easy get-out clause to saying that you can't actually produce stuff that's that funny anymore. Sorry.
But it's not so much that it can't be funny. It's just the idea that it might be funny with an idea of critique or something, or that it might be able to have a political agency beyond just being funny. I think it's quite easy to be funny because there's so much to but it loses its I don't know, the edge.
But it doesn't need to be activism at the same time. I mean, it doesn't need to be activism. I would never define anything I do as activist, even if it's quite politically charged, because I have too much respect for activism as a real attempt to initiate change. I don't think, certainly what I'm doing is that. But it can be funny just without necessarily trying to do more.
At the same time, I imagine all of you, when you're using humour in your work, you do a sort of self-audit and you self-censor. Would that be right?
Oh yeah, I did a performance this week, and there were a couple of gags that I thought, this is going to be too much for this audience.
Yeah.
It was at the Jewish Museum, where I have a work in an exhibition about stereotypes about Jews and money. So certain things I thought, wow, that's just going to go too far, and I had to. And I don't know if I was right. I might actually have just sold the audience short a little bit.
But I think there's points where that really works. So like Tammy Bentor's work presented in New York at the Jewish Museum there, then that becomes kind of really charged with people walking out. So I don't know if you know her work, but she's presenting a whole series of Jewish and Palestinian stereotypes. It's really very complicated and a really punchy move to present it in that context. So I don't know. It's like I don't know what I'm saying there, but I think that it's probably the moment to present it in a way, isn't it? I don't know.
Yeah.
we want artists to be on the edge and make those kind of jokes in a way, but at the same time, you can't. Anyway.
But I don't know if that's a bad thing necessarily. I think you owe it. There's a responsibility in the climate that we're in politically to not add fuel to what is already an atmosphere that is, imbued with ideology that 10 years ago you wouldn't think would be having the platform. And I think that's just that's a responsibility that we should, or I'd like to think we should all carry. But then
I agree. Like 10 years ago, you might be able to make ironic racist jokes and nobody would make much. Now it just adds to an ugliness. You can do it if you want. I just don't know why one would.
I suppose that's why I made a work that was about Brexit, but put a focus on the human voice of, just like of people in Britain. No, it's like it wasn't about really to do with politics. It was about just sort of people calling up and having their own maybe half a minute just to say kind of their bit for Europe, and as part of an archive now. But it's not kind of adding fuel to the fire, but it's talking about something, and you can listen to it back. But it's
Okay.
Interestingly, I saw there was something I read from Sarah Silverman the other day.
Oh yeah.
Who said, she was saying, I probably wouldn't tell the jokes I told 10 years ago now.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's also a personal growth thing, probably as you get older, maybe certain types of gags seem a little bit.
Oh, absolutely.
Less,
I think in different areas of comedy you see it. I mean, in cartooning, people used to use racist stereotypes to make an anti-racist statement. Now they don't. That was part of the Charlie Hebdo problem. Listen, I've got loads more questions, but I think probably it's time to open it up, because I'm really enjoying this, and I hope you are as well. This is a fantastic discussion. And like I say, I've got other things if you don't have questions, but I would love to hear from you if you do. So what would you like to ask our panel?
And if anyone has any good jokes.
Any Yes, we're up for jokes. Okay, so in the front row.
Oh, yes, please.
Just throughout the conversation, I've been thinking about the sort of structural similarities between. Testing.
There you go.
Yay. So throughout that, I was thinking about the similarities, the structural similarities between the circles and cultures that we all live and work within, the sort of art world circles and the comedy circles, the sort of networks, the socialising the groups, the aspirational qualities, even the sort of, to reference what you were talking about slightly, the sort of class nature of it, be it Oxford or Cambridge as being these locations of channeling comedic talent. And I wondered if anyone in the panel had any sort of thoughts on whether or not they see these two spaces, these two social networks as being similar, or they feel they're very, very structurally different.
Massively different, I'd say. Yeah, I think, probably. There you go. I think there's a sort of history in Britain of kind of, the footlights kind of troops. I suppose those things do feed into a certain strand of comedy. They go to Edinburgh, they get a radio series, and then quite a lot of that drifts on. I don't think there's the same. I think there's an understanding in mainstream culture that we need to hear from different voices, and that's being very strongly pursued as an economic imperative by savvy comedy promoters as well, I think. So the two things go hand in hand. I think in the art world it's much more complicated. Class is such a I don't know, it's such a difficult thing to discuss in terms of the art world. I don't know. What role does it have?
But also the economy of it is so strange. Like, how does artwork get supported? That's such an odd thing. God only knows, ultimately. Especially comic work or performative work, how might that be supported in an art context? Generally, it isn't.
That's a good point.
I think if you do a brilliant Edinburgh show, it will get seen and you will get success. I think that's what happens. I think it's still quite democratic. I think there's the free fringe, which is separate to the thing that people have to go into tens of thousands of pounds worth. So you have to sign a contract that you'll fill a certain number of seats, and if you don't, you then have to pay the venue for the seats that you don't fill. So places like the Pleasance and Underbelly and all these places, Underbelly, all those. Whereas, of course, you know, that if you go into the free fringe, it's still this kind of open-ended thing, potentially economically. So you might take a risk and go and do a show. But if you're going to go to the Pleasance, you've usually got an agent behind you, you've usually got a whole... And you have to be a comedian, you have to do 1 million gigs. You just do. There's no way around it. You can't, I think. So you have to encounter every type of audience. And it's just oddly, I think it's quite a separate thing. There are similarities, but I think it's quite a separate thing.
I think the Venn diagrams overlap. I mean, there are certain artists that the club scene fanzines would recognise, you know, David Strickly or somebody like that. At the same time, there are comedians that the art world recognises. So you mentioned Andy Kaufman, which is a classic example of somebody who's seen as a almost performance artist. So they overlap, but they are very different.
Yeah. I wasn't necessarily thinking so much in terms of the sort of structural, sort of hierarchical level of how do you escalate through.
Wow.
I was thinking more horizontally and sort of the sort of cultural space of the communities that build this thing, these two separate groups.
It sounds like you have an idea about that.
Tell us.
What do you think?
I only have an entry point into one of those things, and I can't speak to the other one, but I have an imagination that people are drawn into a sort of community of practitioners, and those have similar support mechanisms across it, but I completely agree that economically the sort of hierarchical structure of how you go from A to Z, how you move up and down is because of the way that money trades and circulates is completely different.
Okay, I wonder if any of you want to talk to that, the idea of community. No.
There's loads of different communities. I think that's something really important if you're exiting an art institution, to understand there are multiple art worlds. Never make a statement about the art world, because there are multiple art worlds. And that's the joyous, elastic nature of the art. The art worlds that are potential to inhabit, that they do, as Andy was saying, that they're elastic enough to contain anything you want to do, which is a joy and a delight. So that's a pleasurable thing. Don't get hung up in kind of hierarchies of the art world and how it operates, because it's social, it's conversational, it's anecdotal, it's taste, it's all sorts of things. I think, I don't know, you're probably more confident if you're middle class or upper class. You're probably, look at Boris Johnson. You're probably more confident. But, it doesn't necessarily mean you're right, but you probably will find more traction amongst certain people who feel comfortable because you speak in the same register that they do. But then a lot of people enjoy spending time with people who don't speak in the same way that they do, in a very generous class. I don't know, I'd like to see it as gaseous, amorphous, on a good day, jolly, full of potential kind of encounters that you wouldn't expect, rather than seeing it as a negative thing to be kind of climbed over in a, I don't know,
But I think that's a really nice sort of way to describe it, if answering that is like elastic. You can go somewhere and come back around and do it again, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm struck by the fact
I like the elasticity thing. It's just kind of opened me up a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I love the idea that some of you talked about having to go in a comedy club. You know, it's amazing, and that really is interesting. Any other questions? I'm sure you must have a few. Yeah. Oh yes, in the front row again.
So I took a note. It's a sort of a question about context of where work is shown, because I was struck by your work, Joe, that was on a beach, and then Andy's film about the physics in comics that was screened at the Cinema Museum, versus my own experience of sometimes seeing work inside galleries that I found really funny, but or live performance as well, but feeling like I was sort of the only person who would actually laugh out loud, because in a gallery a lot of audiences feel like they're meant to be kind of engaging with this kind of serious thing, and you know, this thing about context, whether your audience is expecting to laugh. We had a stand-up comedy night last night, and the audience really wanted to laugh and were incredibly generous towards the performers, even when some of the performances, you know, maybe weren't that great. Like, there was a lot of generosity from the audience, and then they wanted the next performance to be great, and when it went well, they laughed so much. Whereas in a gallery, I've often found that the work was really funny, but everybody was sort of hesitant as to whether they could read it in that way, or whether this was a space in which you can laugh. And yeah, so about the work on the beach and in the cinema museum, my question was, did you, by kind of situating the work outside of an exhibition space, did you actually attract a different audience, or did you just get the same kind of people to come out to a different place to see your work?
No, I think completely 100%. It was in Kent, which is obviously very actually pro-Brexit. It was. I mean, I'm kind of half like from Kent, half from London, and it was really good to come out of the London bubble and engage with people that are because it wasn't a project just about people who wanted to actually stay kind of in the EU. It was a project that was impartial. That was for anyone's opinion, and it was really interesting to go. Because I was down there for a month basically, just talking to all the locals and things like that. And it's a really interesting way. Well, I mean, everyone, you know, you kind of had like it's like quite a large group of people like this is a load of shit, like, and then do you know what I mean? But in a way, that's kind of what it's about. That's kind of great that to put something out on a beach. That's as open as it gets, isn't it? Really.
And presumably your work, Elise, you're putting it out there on the web, and people, you're getting a totally different audience.
Oh yeah, I see the web as one of the best ways of gaining accessibility to different pieces of information, especially for art. Kind of discovering different communities of people who might not know about art history or engage with art in a particular way, and having humour and the internet as their access point for that has been great. But yeah, the reception has been wild. It's been I mean, you get like when you're creating any platform, you kind of gain a community, and those communities have specific characteristics. So our audience was often very young. It was often young girls. It was museum professionals also liked it. So even though it is out on the web, you do kind of accidentally curate your own community. But certainly in terms of getting the work out there and getting people talking about art, it has been a really useful tool in taking it outside of a gallery space and instead just having it on a smartphone or on your computer. Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking that the point you made at the start about, because I think there's some value in the fact that people might go to a gallery and all of a sudden not know how to behave, because we feel very comfortable. Oh, this is a space that we're familiar with, and therefore we can behave in this kind of certain conventions. And I think it's kind of really interesting in those moments. Oh, I'm not sure whether I should be laughing or not, because then that makes you reflect on what your own behaviour is and kind of challenges your responses of that kind of engagement. So I think, in a sense, that's valid as well, that kind of that position.
Yeah, because I mean, it flushes out, you know, what's permissible in any particular kind of social situation or cultural situation. So in a way, it actually enables the ideology to become apparent. You know, whether you feel comfortable, whether it's permissible to laugh in those situations. So I mean, I think we've kind of flirted with the idea of things which have been potentially uncomfortable. We don't know whether it's cruel, and sometimes it seems really, really cruel. And yet it's masked as a kind of comedy. So there is this kind of toing and throwing between, I'm not sure how they kind of behave here, which in a way speaks about the kind of structure which, you know, that's kind of contained and contextualised.
But that could be a positive, that's a positive questioning how
There was a story I read a few years ago in an art fair in New York, I think it was. Some deranged person stabbed someone else, and they thought, everyone around thought it was a performance. They're like, oh yeah.
Oh, was that like in Basel? I think
it was New
I
York.
was there. I think I was
It's
there.
like, oh.
You,
And it's crazy.
You didn't do it.
It wasn't you, was it?
No, it wasn't you.
Didn't say anything.
But yeah, for that moment, people just didn't understand what was going, didn't know how to frame it.
Because everything's in quotation marks
Yeah,
happening in
yeah,
a
it's
gallery
like, oh.
space. So if someone's being racist or misogynist
Yeah.
or, you know, everyone's thinking, oh, right, well, this is a stance. This is a, oh, how am I going to respond to this? Or this is really funny, right? Yes, that's being funny. It's really uncomfortable. It is. I find it uncomfortable watching things in those spaces.
Kind of like a
Because
Black Mirror
everything's at a remove. It's a
episode.
meta... It's a position that you've adopted in order to speak. It's a register that we understand that you have adopted to speak through, which when you go to a comedy club, it's why Andy Kaufman, of course, fantastic genius, because no one really knew what the hell that register was. It was all over the shop. It was like, wait, what? And you were really uncertain as to where you stood with it, which is more interesting, possibly in mainstream culture, because it's more dangerous. It's more of a tricky game to play as to where you stand. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I read a great quote once that ambiguity is seldom tolerated in popular culture. Really like that. Ambiguity, you know, people don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And I enjoy that. Those moments in performances or artist lectures I do where I put people on the wrong foot and see what happens. Again, it's always what's the word, circumscribed by a broader art context. But I'm really curious if, you know, to try stuff that's a little bit out there.
Yeah.
And see if I don't get clubbed to death.
We'll see.
Yeah.
So a couple more questions, and then I think we'll wrap up after that. Can I ask the students very quickly? Presumably you showed the film before we came in, right?
No, you haven't yet.
No. Oh.
Okay.
What's the film?
So is it still on the bill? Okay. When you've wrapped up the conversation, you'll show the film. Okay, fine. Yes, your question, I'm sorry.
I've heard lots of different opinions, but you're all saying very similar things. I'd like to know what you think. What is art? Because art is painting, art is sculpture, art is music, art is comedy. And we're all sitting here, one of the things is, let's have a damn good laugh. If I go into an art gallery, it's the last place where I would feel comfortable in having a damn good laugh. And I quote what other people have said. I think you're all saying the same thing. Because it might be a wonderful place. The Tate is a great place. Art galleries are beautiful pieces of architecture. The works on the walls are amazing. But nobody's laughing. Everybody takes it so seriously. However, when I go to a different form of art, it might be comedy, it might be music, because that's art. I'm in a totally different environment where I actually feel as though I want to come out a bit more and let my emotions show, whether the emotion is to laugh, or to cry, or to cheer, or to just take things into perspective. It's only the latter where I get that in an art gallery. So my question is, what is the future of art in a gallery along those lines? How do we change that perception, that kind of difference between exclusive and inclusive? That's it.
That's one for our time, isn't
So
it? That's
do you think
brilliant.
you can have like a really, really good laugh if it's a piece of artwork that you're just looking at and there isn't someone there kind of, you know, like kind of goading you on and kind of like sort of giving it like a sense of life in that respect?
I think it's how much you invest in it, isn't it?
It's
I mean,
like
you know,
internalised understanding and like humour.
yeah.
If you look at a piece of work, I don't know.
I mean, there's a famous art critic on TV, Andrew Graham Dixon, and he's famous for pointing to a Rembrandt and sort of bursting into tears. And, you know. So what does that mean? What he's basically saying to the audience is, I'm really invested in this. I can really understand it, and it moves me. You know, so that could happen in a gallery, presumably, with comedy.
Yeah.
But
Well, it's subjective, isn't it? You know, you might find that you don't want to laugh in an art gallery or an art museum, and nothing is going to change that. Other people will enjoy seeing work there and engaging with it with that sense of humour. You know, it's not a blanket statement to say that, oh, you can't find things funny in an art gallery. It's a subjective point of view, but certainly I think in terms of accessibility, things can be done to kind of remove this cloak of importance that's put upon these institutions and upon the idea of art with a capital A. But I think there's a long way to go to do that, and also it's like 5 more panel talks worth of conversation to answer that question.
the cloak of importance. say about that? Getting rid of that cloak?
I'd quite like the cloak of importance to stay, otherwise nothing has any value, does it? I mean, there's a degree to which things can be dismissed too quickly, or it's not getting me. It's just that, you know, as an art tutor, I often go into tutorials and the student has to show you what they're doing in 5 minutes, and there's this weird, it's a sort of strange performance, and then I'm kind of, you know, sort of projecting ideas around the student, the artist, saying, oh, is it this? Is it this? Is it that? Is it that? So there's like this odd kind of like, something has to be quickly gettable. Why does it? It doesn't. You know, I like slow art, I like difficult art, I like really annoying, pretentious art, I like beautiful art, I like funny art, I like art that is kind of, you know, really like, poor, that's only for a few people. I like all of that, and I want all that to continue to exist.
So keep the cloak.
Yeah, keep the cloak,
Keep
and
the
actually have people maybe who help make it accessible. And of course, that's what museums and art galleries are doing all the time with all the programs they do about social engagement, public participation. Now there's loads of practice which is about making work in that way, so it already has that sort of social structuring embedded in it. But I don't think, I don't want everything you have to get it quickly, or it has to be immediately accessible, or well, it's not worth anything. I don't know. That's not
I'd agree with that, yeah.
I think those issues about accessibility or perceived elitism it's not just in the hands of galleries. It's, you know, it's a kind of, it's instrumentalised as well. You know, we're kind of told, aren't we, that these spaces aren't for everybody.
Yeah.
So there is a ideological division taking place that is a kind of construct about who should and shouldn't access certain forms of culture. So I think that's a bigger issue politically and socially than just in the hands of artists and galleries, but a kind of challenge to the kind of political system.
And I think at a time...
And the means of address to us all through certain kind of media outlets and all of those kind of things.
And I was just going to add, I think, you know, at a time where it's becoming more expensive to study and there's more financial strain on most people, what the implications of who will continue to make art and on what circumstances are very tied into that.
You mentioned earlier about the museum charge for the show that you're in currently, and it's the first thing that tends to be from kind of centre-right and right-wing governments do, is they, perhaps in Sweden, where all of a sudden the government comes in and says, these aren't for everybody and you shouldn't all be paying for them, so we'll now charge, which then does actually limit access.
And then but then, you know, if these certain museums don't charge, they go out of business. So it's not an easy question by any means, but...
Let's stick to comedy.
Oh, yeah.
One more question from the audience, please. Let's make it a humdinger.
Yeah. A funny question.
A funny question.
Or a joke. Come on.
Or a joke.
So I was thinking about like the internet and meme culture and how quickly like there's a small window where I can find things funny because the internet moves so quickly. So I was just wondering how, as a practicing artist, you deal with that anxiety of like, is this still going to be funny by the time my audience sees it, or is it still going to be funny in a year or when it's not topical? Because for me, like that's something that I'm always thinking about, like how can this continue to be funny when things happen so quickly in our world?
That's a great question. Yeah. So things are moving so fast. How do you compete? How do you?
I think if you make work that's like humorous, it's kind of inherent and it runs through. You know what I mean? And it sort of actually doesn't necessarily keep up. I don't know. So that's just something that just sort of popped into my head. But yeah.
But I think like comedy and politics, it's about timing. You know, that something will have an effectivity in terms of a particular situation, and that'll close down really, really quickly. I mean, that's the nature of ideology. Ideology attempts all the time to smooth things out and eradicate contradictions. So, you know, I think there is something about this idea that, you know, it's fast moving and sometimes you hit it and sometimes you don't. But I think there's also the sense that things can reoccur, they're represented. There's opportunities for things which you think you're done with, you know the meaning of it, can suddenly be brought back into a new set of circumstances, so it resonates in a particular way. So, you know, it's about being incredibly kind of strategic about these things, but recognising that it's a system which is always about closing things down, because it then tends to commodify those things in particular kind of ways, or they're politically ineffective because things have changed and moved on.
Yeah, I mean, for me, or art, I was always sort of looking to see what art can do that then those things maybe aren't already doing. Because there's a place for that. I often wonder how can I compete with something like the effectiveness of them, the way that some almost incredibly affecting things almost made anonymously without art. They kind of things that some of the things I've enjoyed the most in the last handful of years have definitely not been made by artists. They just occur through the kind of machinery of the internet. Like some things chopped out of something or something happens and I'm like, oh God, if I could just get that is sort of what I wanted. But I don't even know who made it or where it came from. So more and more I've adopted thinking, okay, well, if I can't there's no point in trying to replicate that. So I've adopted this strategy of very long form work making. So my films are now almost like an hour or half an hour, and I demand that, like, I'm a show in Bristol Museum at the moment. It tells you when you go in, it's really an hour and a half if you want to see it properly, and there's 2 films in half an hour and all the sculptures. And so trying to think what could art, you're just always trying to think, well, what other way can it be? But there was an interesting thing when you talking about timing with the work. I made Laws of Motion, I started in 2010, and then I made it first in 2012, and no one was that interested. And I put it on a few places as a talk, and people were like, oh, it's okay. And I mean, the premise was, this world had become a cartoon, and Law 1, anybody suspended in space will remain in space until made aware of its situation. It was just walking off a cliff, you don't fall down till you look down. I was like, it's like the banking crash and stuff. And then I kept doing it, and then in 2016, I went back for it and thought, actually, I've got to do this again and try again. And I'd already put Donald Trump in it as a cartoon villain, and I'd put stuff, and this idea that there's this kind of two-dimensionality in the speed, and suddenly the work just worked. And it was nothing to do, I hadn't really changed the piece very much, but the world changed just enough that suddenly I just came back from taking it to Malta, it went to Dubai, it's been to Toronto, New York, it just sort of got, the concept didn't really change, the timing of the work did, so it was this fun, and it was only that I worked on it for 7 years, and so it just, the first 3, and then so there's something that hopefully that you embed within it that like will hook or catch, that isn't just based on a tiny moment.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit aware this piece slightly is that, but it's like hopefully it will kind of choose the longevity of the process and the project. It then goes beyond somehow.
I think you just need to be careful about that, unless you're using like things that happen this week in the news. Whenever I'm as a tutor working with a student who's doing something so of day to day, I always say, well, is this going to be interesting in 30 days? Will people even still be thinking about that?
Yeah.
But I think you can't really worry too much about competing with. You just have to do your thing. Yeah.
Urgency is a compeller, isn't it? So if, as everyone should be, you're rightfully angry about things that are occurring at the moment, then make work about it, because that's.
Sure.
Maybe it will have an effect. Maybe you'll feel better for doing it. Maybe you'll form a group around you that becomes bigger than your thing in and of itself. And I just think, never worry about legacy. There's no point.
Yeah,
it's
a bit arrogant.
Nice.
What will they say in 200
name,
years?
I mean, that's something quite nice, like 5 years after you made something. Yeah.
That's a lovely moment to stop, actually. I mean, what a fantastic discussion. I'd like you to thank our brilliant panel, but also our brilliant students, and do come down and say, talk to us informally afterwards if you would like to. But I've really enjoyed myself, and thank you so much. All right.
Okay. Oh, should we move?
I think we move into the audience.
We should move that way.
Yeah, should we?
Yeah.
Do I have to give back my mic? I like it.
We're here at the Tate Modern. Can you see my phone?
Yeah, no, you can.
And I'll be your host for the afternoon.
Well, you look at an object, right? You look at something and it's your thoughts that creates your perception of it. So then you look at the object and all you see is yourself because you're still thinking about it.
Okay.
Never stop recording. We have some sculptures from the artist Franz West. So I want to do some intuitive noises to them first. Okay, the pink squiggle, let's go closest to the pink squiggle. If you forget about the holes in it, which we'll get to in a second, it kind of looks like a piece of chewing gum. Chew on that for a second. making something very small out of clay may seem like it's something a lot different than it actually is when you put it outside and you make it a bigger thing. These are all just very small, or on a piece of paper. If you saw a bit squiggle on a piece of paper, you'd immediately dismiss it. Random little things on your pages. These are a lot of the things that you'll probably get. So Franz West, by just taking what's on the paper, he is trying to make a point that the paper has become real life, it's become a lot bigger, prompting us to question it, but then actually... Drink that. I feel like a YouTube guy. There. Shit. Sweet. Cool. Oh yeah, oh that's a sick shot. I really like, wait, that's so nice. That's so nice, like that. Nice. Yeah, picture of me with it.